Hi everybody. I'm Kerry Tribe. It's a pleasure to be here. And I thought, so I started putting these images together and I thought I should really go back, way back to what I was doing at Brown. And then I remembered I had 35 minutes and I make videos and films. So I decided to not do that, and I'm only going to show you a couple of pieces today, in addition to talking a little bit about There Will Be, the piece that's in the Bell Gallery right now. It would be nice if I could make this play. Give me 1 second, please. Okay, here we go. So this is an installation view of a double film projection called HM that was included in the 2010 Whitney Biennial, and that's the first piece I'll talk about, HM. Rather than give you any of the background on the story, I'll just say a couple of words and then show you an excerpt of the film installation. I've been working for some time, really since I was at Brown, about how certain subjects don't really lend themselves to cinematic or documentary representation. And memory seems to be a good example. It's a very, ultimately personal experience that we know and hold dear and try to communicate to others, but is necessarily subjective. And for some time I've been doing work about kind of personal memory, cultural memory, and then I had this idea, and I've been kind of trying to find ways over the years to find approaches to working with the moving image that, rather than kind of make a seamless presentation where you have kind of no idea where the image is coming from or how it's been edited, to try to kind of make manifest in the space with you the means of representation that you're seeing, make the loops a kind of central subject of the work in some way. In other words, to try to find a way for the structure of these projects to kind of rhyme with their subject or their content. And I had an idea to make a film that would play through 2 projectors, and I wasn't sure quite what it would be about, but I had heard a story about a man named Henry Malayson who had a terrible case of epilepsy, and in the 1950s, doctors decided to operate on his brain in an attempt to cure him of his epileptic seizures. And the idea was that if they could take out the part of the brain that was essentially misfiring, which was a part deep in the middle of his brain, they could then, without seriously impairing him in any other way, preserve his ability to function and not have these terrible seizures. And so that's what they did. And I think where this little clip begins, it's about an 18-minute film. I'll show 4.5 minutes of footage. And where this begins, I think, is as the procedure that was done on Henry Malayson's brain is being described.
During the operation, Dr. Scoville made 2 small holes in HM's skull. Through these holes, he inserted retractors, which he used to lift up the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes. Aspiration requires inserting a small instrument into the intended target and sucking out brain tissue. So Scoville proceeded to remove the hippocampus on both sides, along with cortex surrounding it, areas that we know today are critical for the establishment of long-term memory.
Henry, what are you describing?
A dream you might have.
So you weren't remembering anything just now?
No, it was like a dream.
Like a dream, or was it a dream?
Well, it was like reality, but still a dream.
HM made a good recovery from the operation, but it was immediately apparent that he could not lay down new long-term declarative memories. His immediate memory was fine, but the instant something distracted him, he lost all sense of what had happened just moments before.
We now know that immediate memory lasts about 20 seconds. HM could therefore remember information for about 20 seconds before it was gone forever.
HM remembers all that happened to him up to the time of his operation, but can recall next to nothing that has happened since. Between 1953 and 20 seconds ago, his episodic memory is blank, and that blank space grows longer at the same pace that his life moves forward.
I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut. One of my best friends lived across the street from me. Our houses had matching floor plans. We used to walk to school together, play hopscotch together. We even made a walkie-talkie with 2 tin cans connected by a string that spanned the street. My friend told me that her father was a neurosurgeon, but I had no idea what that meant. Do you know how old you are?
I know I was born in 26.
Are you in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s?
I think 40s or 50s, right there on the borderline of that,
Where are your parents?
in East Hartford.
Are they there now?
I think they are.
Years later, I found myself reading about a brain operation my friend's father performed on a young man trying to cure his epilepsy. The operation resulted in the patient losing his capacity to make new memories. My friend's father was William Beecher Scoville, and the patient was H.M. I met H.M. in 1962 when I was a graduate student. Beginning in 1966, H.M. used to travel to MIT to the Clinical Research Center where my colleagues and I would test him. So I've known him since 1962 and he still doesn't remember who I am. Have we ever met before, you and I?
Yes, I think we have.
Where?
Well, in high school,
In high school.
yes.
Have we ever met any place besides high school?
Now that I don't, no, I don't think so.
That's a clip. And this is a drawing made by Dr. William Beecher Scoville of the proposed bilateral medial temporal lobe resection. So the surgery was actually a success in that HM continued to have these epileptic seizures, but they weren't so bad that they were ruining his life. He lived to the ripe old age of, I think, 86, and he passed away in 2006 while I was working on this project. But as the voiceover makes clear, he didn't have the ability to encode any new memories, or in fact to really recall any episodic memories from his life before this event. And when I heard, so I'd had this idea to make a film that would go through 2 projectors, and I wasn't quite sure about the subject, but I was interested in kind of trying to find a way, as I often do with my work, to produce a kind of cognitive dissonance for the viewer that might start to replicate in some way a little bit of what it could feel like to be the subject of this film, which isn't to say that any of us can really know what it's like to be living in this kind of very short bracketed period of 20 seconds of working memory, immediate memory. But what I found when I was doing all of these kind of tests in pre-production was that you show a film, you show something on the left, and then 20 seconds later you put it on the right, and you don't feel like you're forgetting anything, you feel like you're seeing it twice. But somehow when we started working on it, things started to change, and as I began to kind of play with the sort of rhythm of this, image coming up again, and realize that every time an image is on the left, it'll come back 20 seconds later with a new image on the left, and a new kind of editorial juxtaposition will be made. And I started thinking about this kind of process of montage in a new way, and realizing that all of this kind of meaning that was being generated was contextual, and that in fact all of us in the audience, including myself as the film's maker, also have 20 seconds of working memory. And so what seems to happen, at least in reports that I hear, is that even though you have to walk by these two projectors to go in and see the film, people seem not always to believe that in fact it's two parts of the same film that you're seeing at the same time. In other words, people have said, you know, it's interesting, I heard this was one film, but obviously it's two films because there's different, you know, you chose a different take the second time. Or sometimes I notice that the slides that come up are like the right date and sometimes they're the wrong date. But people don't seem to realize that it's actually the same image and the same slide, and it is a sort of frozen moment in time, but its context is going to shift. And so, I mean, the way that the brain does encode memory is essentially if something happens that doesn't have a kind of strong emotional resonance for you, it tends not to really be remembered at all. So at some point I came up here, and at some point I adjusted my light because it was bothering me, and at some point I checked my phone, but none of that all really matters, so I don't really know when. If my dongle breaks and the image cuts out, I will remember that. I'll know exactly where I was. So anyway, these things, they sort of started getting me to think about different ways of working in this kind of terrain of memory, and how, you know, one might be able to work with the medium in a way to kind of position the viewer hopefully in an empathic relationship to the subject, but one that's empathic through their phenomenological experience, through the feeling perhaps of a face arriving on the screen that you can't recognize, that you feel you should know, or a date that seems like it might not be right. So anyway, to make this work, we had to customize a couple of projectors. There's a lot of sort of technical stuff that seems to always go wrong when I show it. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the technologies that were used in the production of the film in the first place. So I don't remember if this scene was in the clip that you saw, but a lot of the footage in the film has this kind of home movie quality of like 16 millimeter film. It's all shown on 16 millimeter, but the reenacted parts were shot on high definition video, transferred to 35, and then dumped down to 16. But I also went to these locations that were significant to the life of Henry Molaison and filmed there. So that's how I shot that scene with a friend's borrowed Bolex, which I don't really recommend doing. But the Bolex was a kind of interesting tool for the project, because the Bolex is actually this very old, extremely sturdy camera that people still use that has a crank on the arm for the motor. And you wind it up, and if you continuously hold the recording trigger, it'll go for about 20 seconds before it runs out of steam. And so when I realized that, I thought, okay, all of the quote-unquote real material should be shot with this camera. And this is an image on the left that's clearly not from 1991, but it reminded me of another image I'd seen in 1991. And I sort of allowed this kind of idiosyncratic and subjective meandering through history to occur as I structured the piece, and thought a lot about all of these things that had happened post HM's surgery in the 50s that he had no idea had happened. He didn't know we'd landed on the moon. You know, he didn't know about the civil rights movement. He didn't know about the women's rights movement. He didn't remember Kent State. The next piece I wanted to talk about also involves language and memory, and is a kind of nice transition maybe to speaking about the piece that's in this show here. I saw a film by Hollis Frampton a few years back called Critical Mass. If you've ever seen it, it's really an amazing film. If you ever get a chance to see it, you should. In 1971, Hollis Frampton, who was an experimental filmmaker and a photographer and a writer, was invited to go to SUNY Binghamton to work with the students in the film department for a couple of weeks as like a visiting artist. And he immediately asked faculty in the department who the two most volatile kids in the program were. And the unanimous answer came back that it was these two people on the left, whose names are Barb de Benedetto and Frankie Albetta. And so he said, you know, you think that they could be convinced to work on a film of mine? And everyone said, well, you can ask them. So he did, and all he told them was, I'd like you to be in this film. I've never shot sync sound before. This will be a sync sound project. And I want you guys to improvise an argument. Frankie, you've been gone for a couple of days. Barb, you're his girlfriend. You want to know where he's been. Frankie, don't tell her. And when I say go, we'll load the camera, we'll start shooting. And when I say cut, we'll cut. And they proceeded to have this incredible tear-down argument that lasted about 8 minutes. And Frampton was satisfied, and he went home. And then he took the negative and he duplicated it made three, well, he didn't duplicate the negative, but he made 3 prints from the film and proceeded to cut it up into these little tiny snippets and sew it back together. So the resulting film was 25 minutes long, this kind of staggering, brawl between this couple in which they very, very, very slowly kind of get through the argument, but the argument itself keeps looping around. So it has this kind of staggering, stuttering effect that when I saw was absolutely mesmerizing, and for some reason I thought, well, this is like the best kind of structuralist film. It's really about its medium, but it's also about the kind of way that couples and arguments often go nowhere, and it's really about culture in a way. Like you can hear the Brooklyn accent, you can feel the kind of dynamics of their kind of normal heterosexual relationship, and that she's sort of uncomfortable in her role as a woman in the 70s, and this dynamic between them was so vivid. And I thought, well, what would happen if we tried to take the film out of the structural film? What would happen if I could find 2 very talented actors who could reenact this as a live performance? And so that's what I tried to do. The actors on the right are Emily O'Hara on the left and Nick Huff on the right. And it's a 25-minute live performance, and seeing a video of it isn't quite the same, but I'll show you a little excerpt of the video anyway.
I just had to get away for a while. That's all. Get away for a while. That's all.
Let's get away.
That's all.
Let's get away.
And I wasn't far.
Yeah.
And
why don't you just
and
why don't you just go away permanently? Why don't you just go away permanently now? Permanently now. Just make it. Just make it.
What?
Let's make it. Just make it.
What?
Let's make it a little bit more permanent. A little bit more permanent. Become more permanent. Because I don't dig this shit. I don't dig this shit. You know. I mean, you owe me. You owe me a little bit. You owe me a little bit of courtesy, like a phone call.
well, I'm sorry. I couldn't get to a phone.
Look, this is going absolutely no place. Absolutely no place. It's going
Perfectly all right.
It's going
Perfectly all right. All right.
What would you?
All right.
What would you that you couldn't get to a? And would you that you couldn't get to a phone? Imagine
I-
you couldn't get to a phone.
None of your fucking business. You don't have to know. Don't have to know, and it's not to know, and it's none of your business.
All right, then. Your whole trip is none of my business. I don't ever want none of my business. I don't ever want to see you. Get the hell to the apartment. Get the hell to the apartment. Clear the apartment. Clear out your crap. Air out your crap. Just get out of my life. This I don't need.
I'm not getting the fuck out of any apartments. I'm not getting the you get the fuck out. You get the fuck out of the apartment. Fuck out of the apartment.
You get the fuck out of the apartment. Fuck out of the apartment. I'm not
sorry.
apartment, man.
I'm sorry, I'm not. I'm sorry, I'm not.
I'm not the one who rented it.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm not. I'm sorry, I'm not.
I paid more rent on that. More rent on that damn apartment than you. The damn apartment than you did.
I'm sorry, I'm not. I have no place.
You're not.
I have no
You're
place
not.
to go.
All right,
no
now.
place to go.
All right, then I'll go.
Oh,
All right,
place to
then
go.
I'll go. I'll go. I have other places to go. There are other places to go. There are plenty of guys that I can live. Plenty of guys that I can live with. I don't need your shit. Don't need your shit.
Probably have been.
So one of the things that interested me in this project was the way that originally this kind of spontaneous thing, this improvisation by people who weren't even actors, was recorded with the technology of its time and then edited and preserved. And apparently Frampton went back to Binghamton to show the work a year later when he had edited it. And Frankie was interested, and Barb ran out of the theater crying, saying, "I'm being made to look like a complete fool." I was able to track down Frankie, and he's now an accountant, and he lives in Connecticut. And it's funny because his memories of the piece are quite different from the sort of official records of it. I mean, he says, we came up with this idea, and Barb and I weren't really dating, but there was always some tension, and, and the scholars insist Frampton came up with the idea. But to my mind, like taking this spontaneous thing, turning it into this highly structural film, and then reverse engineering it to figure out what that original argument had been was a kind of unorthodox approach, and it turned out to be a necessary one for the actors to be able to get a sense of their bearings in the larger argument overall. So they do memorize in excruciating detail over the course of about 6 to 9 months this extraordinarily precisely choreographed linguistic feat. But they also kind of know where they're going in the argument. And that kind of inverted relationship between performance and its document struck me as kind of an interesting way of thinking through language. And I was working on this when a funny opportunity fell into my lap, which is the next piece that I'll talk about, which is called There Will Be, and it's the piece that's included in the Bell Gallery. There was a big series of exhibitions around California a couple of years ago that was spearheaded by the Getty, but took place in every major museum in the state, called Pacific Standard Time. And it was an historical show. It ended in, the period it was looking at ended in the 80s. But some people involved with it wanted to have a chance to kind of bring younger Californian artists into the discussion. And so they rented this incredible venue called Greystone Mansion in Beverly Hills. And this is a picture of Greystone Mansion. And they invited, I think there were 25 of us, who they said, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we have this event scheduled here called the Ball of Artists that's highly formal. It's in this incredible mansion. And we'd like you to come to the site and take a look at it and look into its history and try to figure out something you might want to do for this one night. And so stupidly I thought, okay, why don't I make like the most ambitious film I've ever made? I'd never made a narrative film, and to back up a little bit, Greystone Mansion's history was explained to me as I toured the grounds with one of the park rangers that now runs it. It's now property of the city of Beverly Hills. And it was built in 1928 by Edward Doheny Sr., who you'll see in this next image. That circled guy is Edward Doheny Sr., who had only one son. His son Doheny Sr. was an oil tycoon. He's essentially the man that discovered oil coming from the La Brea tar pits on the wheel of a wagon and started digging around and realized that the city was full of it. And if you've ever seen There Will Be Blood, that story is loosely based on an Upton Sinclair novel called Oil, which is loosely based on Doheny's story. He was a kind of self-starter Irish immigrant who struck it rich. And he had this one son who was also named Edward Doheny. He was a grown man, and he built Greystone Mansion for his son. But before it was completed, he was indicted, Doheny Sr., in a bribery scheme that has now become known as the Teapot Dome scandal, in which it was claimed he had sent his grown son and his son's personal secretary with a black bag full of cash, $100,000, to the Secretary of the Interior of the United States at the time, Albert Fall, to bribe him to allow them exclusive drilling rights to some very oil-rich land. And conveniently, the two men who were the carriers of that black bag died before they could ever testify against Doheny Sr. The secretary was blamed. It was said that he went crazy and slayed Doheny's son and then killed himself. And if you don't like anything gory, it's not that bad, but the next image is gruesome. These are the crime scene photos from Greystone Mansion 4 months after they moved in. The secretary, Hugh Plunkett on the left, was found in that position in the hallway just outside of the secretary's personal quarters. In the image on the right, where Doheny Jr., the heir to the Doheny fortune, was found murdered. And everything was blamed on the secretary, but a lot of evidence pointed to the contrary. The blood on Doheny's face appears to have pooled, so his body must have been turned over after he kind of fell on his face. Plunkett had a warm gun in his hand hours after the murders took place, and when the gun was taken into evidence, they fired it plenty of times. They could never make it heat up at all. So it's sort of a big question, like how did this really happen? And strangely, nothing's ever really been done with that question. I'm surprised a film has never been made, but when I went to the mansion and saw it in its completely emptied state, it occurred to me that it might be possible to investigate this again and kind of, bring it back to life and figure out what might really have happened through the language of all of the films that had been shot at Doheny Mansion, at Greystone Mansion over the years. So if you've ever seen There Will Be Blood, or X-Men, or Spider-Man, or The Big Lebowski, or Garfield, or any of the other, Hard to Kill, Batman and Robin, High School High, Hanging Up, Mercury Rising, Charlie's Angels Full Throttle, Rockstar, you've seen Greystone Mansion and just didn't know it. It's one of the most popular sort of fancy filming locations in LA. So I had this idea, like, what if I could find everything that was ever said in the kind of public archive of memory, the cinematic memory that's been created for Greystone Mansion by all the films that were shot there, and use nothing but that dialogue to talk about the things that no one ever really said, that we don't really know what happened, but that clearly did happen there. And it was really uncanny how easy it was to write that script. So on the left, you see this little piece from the New York Times right after the murders, and it says, Mrs. Doheny thought noise of first shot was someone turning over furniture. And then one of my favorite films of all time, All of Me, with Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin from 1984, Tyrone, the blind musician, says, someone just knocked over some furniture. Sounds like an end table with tchotchkes on it. So, and that was after a gunshot. So it was like the thing was practically writing itself. And in the end, it occurred to me that there were basically 5 plausible ways these men could have died, the least plausible of which is the official story. So in my film, you see 5 versions of this murder. And in the first, you get the official story, which is kind of debunked subsequently. The official story is that Plunkett comes in, he's sick, he gets a gun, he murders his boss, he's seen by the family doctor, and then he kills himself. But the other versions include the wife catching the 2 of them, and I completely forgot to mention, they were lovers. Yes, they were actually lovers. They kept an apartment together in New York, and Plunkett had his own wing of the mansion, and it's pretty clear that and they'd known each other since boyhood, and they were very, very, very close. So she had a motivation to kill them. The father, Doheny Sr., of course, had motivation because if they were allowed to testify, they would either have to perjure themselves or indict him. Many people, in fact, the people that work at the mansion primarily believe that the father hired a hitman to kill Plunkett, who accidentally killed his son instead and then had to murder Plunkett to cover that up. Anyway, so they go on and on. I think probably Doheny Jr. himself was the murderer, but it doesn't really matter what I think. So sometimes in the exhibition, the script is included in a way that's accessible to the audience. This is a view from the power plant in Toronto. There were also these portraits that were made when we were in production. I was sort of interested in the way that like a still moment might capture, she never dies, so she's alive, but might capture someone who's sort of both dead and alive at once. And I got really obsessed with the actual facts around the case, and so everything that happens in my film is plausible. This is exactly how the blood really ran on Plunkett's face. And this is an installation view of it, which you can just go in the other room and see. So the last thing I'll do is just show a little clip of the film, in case you haven't seen it yet, and then we can do some Q&A.
You been there all night?
I've got a plan. I can't even sleep. I'm losing my mind. And now you're trying to defend your father's honor. We're responsible. I did everything in the world to keep this from happening. I don't want to testify about it. I don't want it to exist. I know. I don't think we make it together. What are you talking about? You found a way out?
No. A door. The front door.
What are you doing?
Thank you for being so good to me. You are not thinking rationally. I am. Give me the gun. Give me the gun.
Childers was a sensitive person.
Yes, I suppose he was.
I see. Would you like a drink? Please. You're right. We've had it. But you can't leave me. What else can we do? You want us to be together? One way or another, we're getting out. We understand each other. All right.
Again.
And on that note, I think I'll fix us some drinks. May I speak to you for a minute? Somebody clean up the scene.
It all seems to point in one direction.
His body was moved. The blood runs up. And what is that, a cigarette?
And,
I'm not going to stack the deck against this guy. He's been murdered, sir.
tell me, you enjoy this kind of work?
So one thing I just want to say about it is that, about this project that was kind of particularly challenging for me is that in this case, this is the first time I'd made a narrative film, and it's the first time I had worked with a crew of this scale. There were about 45 people on set. There were very intense filming restrictions because we were given the mansion for free, but that meant we had to keep things under a certain size. And I had this ridiculous script that was full of the schlockiest dialogue from some great and some really terrible movies. I mean, I used Garfield all over the place in this film. So it's funny. I mean, I talked with a number of artists in the department here, students in the program, today and yesterday about kind of having a foot in one door of fine art practice or art making and a foot in another door of engineering or other fields. And in my case, this is the first time that I made something that I really thought ultimately needed to return to the theater as a sort of site to interact with its audience. That's my alarm. So I'll finish up. But the point that I wanted to make is that when I look at it, I feel like it flies great in the art context because it's like, ooh, the production values are good and we get the concept. And if you see it here, you can even see the kind of, all the glory of Greystone Mansion as it's pictured in every film that is appropriated, whose dialogue is appropriated from mine. But when I saw it at the New York Film Festival, I'm like squirming in my chair because of all the ways in which even the best acting can't kind of bring to life and create truly empathic characters when they're forced to kind of cobble together this dialogue. And so, I was just sort of thinking back to like that kind of, as Dawn was talking about, that sort of distanciation that we're all taught, how to view critically, how to, engage in, mass media representations with a kind of distance, but also loving the stuff. And so even with a project like this that is so kind of conceptually driven and not, supposedly not really about making you care about the characters, it kind of breaks my heart that in the end, because they die over and over and over again, you never really come to care about the characters. So that's just sort of full disclosure about the kind of, sometimes it's really satisfying and fun to kind of be in both of these worlds, and sometimes they present conflicts to one another that maybe can't comfortably be resolved. But that's it for my spiel. Thank you. Any couple of questions maybe before we move to our larger panel discussion? Yeah.
In the dialogue that you took from other movies, did it have to be said in the mansion or could it be said anywhere in the world?
No, it was all things that were said in the mansion on film, in a feature film, not in commercials or short films, because there were sort of countless numbers of those, but these were all major films that had been released. And it was all dialogue from the mansion. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
How did the restrictions that Greystone Mansion gave you, how did those affect the final piece?
Well, one thing that's kind of infuriating, you saw one shot in the clip I showed of this long hallway with a checkered floor, which is an iconic location. No one ever shoots in the guest wing, which is kind of casually referred to as the murder wing or the murder room. So when we were shooting, we were actually shooting with actors who looked like the people they were portraying, lying on the ground in the places where the people they're portraying actually died, where a matter of 10 years earlier, the bloodstains had still been on the floor. There were restrictions on the house that I think like the spirits of the dead might have placed on us. It was extremely fucking spooky there. I mean, and I can tell you guys maybe afterwards outside about some of the really freaky things that happened while we were shooting there. But the mansion itself, there were rules like, you can't adhere anything to the walls. So if you wanted to light in a small doorway, you could put a tension rod between the molding, but that might not be really where you want the light. You really want the light higher, which would mean it would have to touch the walls. No, you can't do that. You couldn't hang any art on the walls. You couldn't have any water or food on set. And when you have actors lying in blood for 6 hours at a time, it's nice to be able to give them a drink of water. We weren't allowed to use a proper generator, which means that we couldn't light the major areas of the mansion that are so iconic. That all the lighting in the basement, I guess we didn't include that clip, but there's a shot of the bowling alley where in the final scene of There Will Be Blood, Daniel Day-Lewis bludgeons that young preacher to death with a bowling pin. Such an amazing scene. It was great to shoot there because actually the lighting, P.T. Anderson had to recreate that bowling alley into all of its original splendor to be allowed to film there when he shot There Will Be Blood. So all we had to do was stick a camera in there and it looked exactly like a scene from There Will Be Blood. But in some of the more grandiose spaces, we simply couldn't, without bringing in a massive generator and doing all kinds of things we weren't allowed to do, work in those areas. So that was a little heartbreaking for me. Yeah.
You said you got this opportunity because there were going to be a lot of artists there for some events. So were those artists the actors?
Oh yeah, sorry, I never really finished the story. So there was this event in January, and I was invited 6 months earlier, so whatever that is, like June. And then they kept saying, you can have the mansion for 5 days, you can have the mansion for 5 days, but they kept postponing that. So in the end, there was this big ball of artists, formal ball, where artists did various interventions in the space. 10 days after I wrapped production. So I had 10 days basically to edit my film, and then it was shown in the mansion, which was kind of amazing to see, but it was also a very rough cut without the final sound, and it didn't have its color and everything. But pretty cool to get to see it in the space where it was shot, where the history really happened, and it sort of felt like, you know, coming around full circle.
Were other films shot in the space, or what kinds of other projects?
Oh, so some people, no, I was the only person who made a film. Some people did work because they, you know, everybody knew about this sort of intense cinematic history of the site. Some people did work that involved sort of fantasy restagings of some of the stories that were shot there. Other people, there was a very memorable performance by an artist named Catherine Andrews, an LA-based artist who had clowns juggling and breaking plates in the kitchen. So you were allowed to walk through, but if you did, you might get like clocked by a flying plate. There's an amazing dance outside in the circular rotunda. I mean, it's a huge mansion. It's 46 bedrooms, 55,000 square feet, or it might be 55 bedrooms, 46,000 square feet. I can't remember, but it has its own gated private grounds that have shrunk over the years because at the time in the 20s, Beverly Hills was its own sort of outpost of LA, and yeah, so there was sort of all kinds of stuff going on out there. The man Doheny Jr., who died in the mansion, had a collection of guns in his gun room, and he had game brought into the grounds, and he would shoot out the window the game and kill the animals, and then have the wait staff bring them, I guess it was the valet, would bring it to the dumbwaiter and bring the carcass up to his private carving room outside of his private gun room, where he would clean and butcher the thing and then send it down to the kitchen to be eaten. There was also a special meat locker down one of the hallways where in subsequent years one of the maids hung herself. A man was murdered in the basement, a child fell out a window. There were a total of 6 violent deaths in about 15 years after the house was finished. Yeah. It's probably all the time. There's one more question. Should we?
I can wait till the panel.
Okay. Thanks.